Hi, welcome everyone to It's the End of the Week podcast. Today I have with me Amanda Mayer and Romain Pietkiewicz, which we're going to be talking about ERP implementations. We're not going to be talking about pitfalls today, which is often too discussed, but we're going to be talking about kind of what are the trade-offs that we think about whenever we're talking about these kind of implementations. So we're going to dig right into the subject. So, Amanda, if I were to ask you, what do clients typically ask for whenever we start an implementation project? What do they want?
Everything. Everything. Everything they don't have, everything they don't know, right? And everything that they've always wanted. And oftentimes customers also will approach it from their processes and their ideas and their products are unique. So approaching it from understanding what everything is from a unique perspective at the same time. So everything.
And would you say it's realistic
No.
to implement everything at once?
No, it's not. Especially a company that is coming from a less sophisticated environment, right? So if they are in an ERP that doesn't have the functionality that, say, Business Central does, there's a learning curve that takes a decent amount of time and aspects of the system that require lots of data that you're just not going to have on day one. So it may not be realistic to start with everything.
Okay, so what we're saying to recap is that whenever people start ERP projects, they're typically being sold, well, you could do everything pretty much with it,
Absolutely.
and that's what the expectation is.
Absolutely.
But unfortunately, it's sometimes unrealistic because it's too big of a bite.
Yes.
So today, we're going to have Amanda that's going to be helping us understand kind of what are the reporting, what are the different aspects of the data that we could utilize from these ERP implementation. And Romain, which is more on the operation side of things, he's going to be telling us that, well, most of the time, Amanda's asking for too much.
That's true.
So that's just a little bit of context for everyone.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's say we're implementing an ERP as the director of operations, and we tell you, all right, well, now you're going to need to scan whenever you're receiving inventory, scan when you put away inventory, scan when you want to pick inventory. What do you tell me about that?
Sounds like more steps. So I would say typically what we come across is exactly that. We need to ship a lot of goods out of the door. We need to manufacture as much as possible with the least amount of steps possible. And typically what finance is asking for is more and more information, and that just requires us to put more information to the system. So there's that disconnect between, giving more information and also then having to do the steps to actually record that. So
Yeah, and I would argue that if we don't do those steps, you don't know what inventory there is, which makes your job harder to get inventory back out the door, right? So then we end up looking for people who have tribal knowledge of this inventory is always sitting on this shelf. What happens when it's not sitting on that shelf, right? And that's where the conversation starts. But also I want to be able to create my financial statements and tell me how much inventory I have in the building. And if we're not doing all those steps, how do we know that?
So I feel there's really a kind of tug of war going
There
on
is,
between what
absolutely.
you want and what Romain wants.
100%.
So what's the right way to approach this? And the reality is that there's going to be trade-offs whatever we do, right? So
Yeah.
how do we find what's the right level of trade-off whenever we're doing that kind of implementation when we're starting from, let's say, a ERP that has no inventory tracking or has less functionality in it? How do we initiate this?
I think it's important to start with the right people at the table. So you already have 2 of the 3 people that should be at the table so that we can talk about the issues that operations have, the issues that accounting and finance or back office have, and I'll even include sales and marketing in that as well. And then what can IT do, right? So Roman's example of having to scan everything in the new system requires technology to do that in addition to the ERP as well. Without technology or IT department's involvement, they may not also get the right products, or perhaps they get too few and still the people are not involved. So having the right people at the table for the discussion is the first step.
I think part of it as well is sometimes we have clients where we go in and yes, there's going to be more steps to the process, but they forget the stuff they do around those processes that is taking time.
Yeah.
For example, now we receive goods, but every end of day we're looking for inventory, or we spend this amount of hours trying to find boxes around the warehouse.
Yeah.
And so it's bringing those points to the conversation as well. Of yes, there might be more rigor in your process, but here are all the other areas where you're going to save time, where other members of your team
Yeah.
or other departments are going to save time as well,
Yeah.
and just get to more efficiency in your process.
Well, understanding what happens physically is one of the first places to start with all of it, right? If you don't know what the physical flow is, you can't build a technological flow around it.
Absolutely.
And I thought it was interesting when you said we need to bring the right people to the table.
Yeah.
And I think that could vary depending on who you're speaking to. So, when you say we got to bring IT, we got to bring operations, we got to bring finance, how do we go about, or what's the best way that we could identify for a business who the right people are, and how do we make sure that they free up their schedule so that they are brought into the conversation?
That's an interesting question, because a lot of times you can end up in a situation where you think you have the right people and then you don't. And I think that it's a combination. There's different levels of involvement in a project. Decision makers have to be at the table for understanding what processes we're trying to improve. But the decision makers aren't always the people who know the processes. Right?
I was gonna say,
how many times?
Ideally, you need a combination of both.
You need a combination. You need a combination of both, because as the operations manager, you could say, well, this is the process I put in place, but then you go and you talk to the actual warehouse or manufacturing people, and that is not how they do it. And that's the first disconnect. So.
Or vice versa, you have the
Yes.
people that know the process, but then they're unable to make certain decisions, and then you end up just stalling because the decisions
yes.
never get made.
Yeah. So depending on the part of the project, where you are and what you're doing in the project, you're going to have to involve different people. Always, though, you have to have decision makers involved in ultimate process decisions, because they're the ones that are going to say yes or no to additional technology, additional people, because maybe part of this is that it's a resource issue and they just need to find more people.
And would you have an example of an area that is typically of debate between, let's say, finance, operations, and IT, whenever we get in these implementations? If you go from someone, let's say,
Yeah.
that is, pen and paper, and now they say, I want it all. What would be a good example of something that we run into?
Manufacturing is probably one of the biggest ones, right? Accounting wants to, or even C-suite wants good reporting. I want to know how much I'm making. But you don't know how much you're making truly if you don't know what your costs are. You can't get accurate costs if you're not putting information into the system, right? And usually in a manufacturing environment, it's not the cost of the raw materials that's the issue. It's the cost of everything else. The added labor, any additional consumables that go into that are not part of the BOM and routing. So that's one of the first places, because then in the manufacturing area, in order to get the best costing information, you have to record every single piece of material in the BOM. You also have to record every piece that you consume, even if you overconsume, right? And you also should accurately record your labor and overhead.
All of which is
Take
an additional
time and
step in the
effort.
process,
Yes,
which
absolutely.
is usually where the change,
Which is
the
where the
disconnect comes from.
conflict starts coming in, because they don't potentially have the resources or the capacity to be able to do that.
And I understand Romain's point to say, well, I'm not doing it today. It's not going to help me tomorrow. Why should I care about it? What is my incentive to be able to get that done, right?
Correct, and to be honest, sometimes the answer is there is no immediate incentive for the production team, right?
Right.
But that's where the parties at the table need to be present to make that,
Yeah.
to walk that path, to understand
Mhm.
where we're going, because I might need to spend 5 minutes more recording a process, but if it's saving you 3 hours a week, then that might just be the business decision to make.
And that's a very interesting answer that you provided. And I think one of the things that we run into a lot whenever we're doing these implementations is, I want everything. I don't know how to to walk yet, and I want to run. How do we bridge that gap, or how do we typically go about bridging that gap? I think manufacturing is a great example of it.
Yeah.
To say, well, today we're pen and paper, and tomorrow everyone says we want to be full automated, right? Let's remove the risk of
Yeah.
employees. Let's remove the risk of variable. How do we get there? What's the typical approach?
I would look at how you can break down the longer term goal into smaller, more achievable steps. So while we might be now in a better system that can track all of those things, we might still not have the capacity to record actuals, for example. So a little work ahead of time in the process of the implementation of things like time studies can allow us to do things like backflush, labor, and overhead. Is it accurate necessarily? No. Does it account for new people who take longer to produce things and being able to evaluate new people with that data? No, but it's a starting point where you could do something like backflush, and maybe that's your 6 months, and then you reevaluate it and you say, all right, are there certain aspects of manufacturing that should now be actuals? And how do we do that? And can we do it systematically, or do we have to do it manually in the system? So you might then start looking at a third-party product that integrates with that to reduce the amount of overhead to the operations team. Like, they're still going to have to do the action so that the system knows what, but the difference between taking a piece of paper and writing it on and taking that paper now to a computer and entering it, that overhead is much bigger for your team.
Yeah, but I think sometimes, to your point, there is an intermediate way to get there.
Yeah.
The paper checklist that often follows the production process is an important piece of paper, and we don't need to get rid of it right away. We
Right,
might say,
and you're probably already using it.
correct.
Yeah.
So we might say, well, some of these aspects of productions we're now going to record in the system, either real time or after the actual production
Yeah.
process. But as a tool, this paper checklist, keeps on living for
Yeah.
a while at least,
Yeah.
until we get accustomed with the new process.
So finding those steps of where you can make small changes to your process. And typically also you have flexibility in where you implement those changes, especially if the implementation is still using paper and manually entering it in the system. Then maybe you start with a class of product or something like that, your most variable products. Maybe some of your products are pretty consistent and you're not worried about those variances. So choose your products that have maybe batch manufacturing where it's going to fluctuate a lot, or the materials costs fluctuate more, and you're looking at those things.
Well,
So
the
you don't have
share
to
of the cost
the
itself,
share of the
right?
yeah. You don't have to chew everything. You don't have to do everything all at once.
So what you're telling me is I'm going to pay full price for my implementation, I'm paying
Mhm.
full price for my licenses, and you're not even automating me right away. Is that what
Correct.
you're saying?
Yes, but in the end, even with full automation, there are still people that have to do things for full automation, right? And the labor of getting full automation may not be what your company can handle today.
Of course.
I
And-
think
Right.
clients often also forget that to have something automated, it needs to be very rigorous in the way it happens.
Proven.
Well, proven, but also we need to be able to code it
Yeah.
essentially, right?
Yeah.
And so we often get customers that they're not able to even define themselves the process, and it changes with every every time it happens. So
Yeah.
then trying to automate that just doesn't make sense at
Doesn't
this
make
point,
sense.
and that's where the disconnect often is.
You need to be able to standardize your process before you could
Correct.
automate it to
Yeah.
a certain extent. And it's funny because we were talking about capturing your data in real time for your production orders, and sometimes we run into companies that don't necessarily even use production bombs.
Yeah.
Right? So we're like
Yeah.
one step even ahead. So sometimes people say, hey, I want it all, and then when you talk about the concept of the difference between a production bomb and a production order,
Yeah.
that's already a step that needs to move from kind of a static master data to just an operational document. Just that is sometimes a bite that you want to take initially. So
It is.
it's interesting.
I often flip the question the other way around, to the customer to say, okay, if you had to code this in the system with simple if-when
Yeah.
statements, how would you do it?
How would
Tell
you-
me how
yeah,
this can
yeah.
actually operate, and then they say, oh yeah, we don't know our process that
Yeah.
well, we can automate it.
We can. We have pretty good examples of companies that have stepped into manufacturing, to your point, that they do have a physical manufacturing process, but they could not take on the effort of manufacturing in Business Central. They didn't have the resources, they didn't have the people who actually understood even the costing portion of it. So it was not even just an operations gap, it was an accounting gap as well. And what was important to recognize is understanding the impact of the choices that we make and the company made. They decided not to do manufacturing, so inventory was just counted every month, right? Well, there's an impact to that in the way the system transacts that and what's available to them from a reporting perspective. So as long as you know what the gaps are and the timing and all those things, you can build the process then for understanding that we know for 2 months out of the, or 2 weeks out of the month, inventory's not gonna be right. Right?
Yeah.
And we have to calculate back into it, but that was the way their previous system was doing it. So we didn't force manufacturing on them. They're actually going live very soon with it. But it was a process to get there, right?
Mhm.
They didn't force it right away.
Correct, and I think part of it is also making sure customers understand that the process after go live keeps evolving as well.
Yes.
We often have smaller clients that think that we go live with something and then
And it's
that's
done.
it forever. It will never
Yeah.
change. So explaining the flexibility of ERPs and their configuration is important as well to say,
Yeah.
this can evolve with your process and it can be something that continuously improves.
And I would say not only can, but
Should.
will.
Should.
Yeah, should, and will.
It's an investment,
And
right?
It is, and now especially with modern architecture for ERPs, which are typically cloud-based and they typically stay up to date. Well, the idea is to say let's implement a good foundation. And to the question I was asked to kick off this podcast was, hey, what do I want? I want it all. Well, you can get to deploying everything, but it's very difficult to deploy everything at once. There's going to be
Yeah.
some trade-offs.
Yeah.
You're going to have those discussions and you'll have your reality check during the implementation. And to Rame's point, which is a very good point, well, once you go live, it's just the first step
Mhm.
of your technological maturity with your system,
Yeah.
right? You need to think about how do I keep adjusting to the new process that's happening and how do I get leveraging more and more as I gain maturity in my processes and my technologies.
I think one critical piece to what I'll call a phased approach to functionality and processes is having at least a good 30,000 foot view of what the end goal is. There are critical pieces to any ERP architecture that you want to build into the beginning, even if it's not used until later. So how you group your items, for example, that can build into how you then decide to manufacture them, how you decide to report on them. And it seems kind of silly, well, my items are, finished or raw, but if you take a little bit of time of understanding what the end goal is, you can build some of that into it, because you don't also want to make choices that are much more difficult or impossible to
change.
like I don't want to scan everything. If you talk about like serialized or lotted inventory, those become decisions that are very hard to change to keep track of the same thing. So
that really brings us back to the initial point we had,
Yeah.
which is have the right people in the room.
yes,
Understand there's going to be trade-offs.
Yeah.
Understand where we want to get to and the decisions we need to make to get to. And by having the right people understand why the decisions are taken because they understand the long-term impact of it. So we talked about manufacturing, which is, I think, a very good example of these trade-offs. But there's a slew of different trade-offs that we do during the implementation projects, and that doesn't only happen during the design part, because as you learn to use a system and you understand how it's going to have an impact on your operation, all these kind of keep popping up, and it's important to continue having these discussions throughout the project, being very transparent about what these different elements are, because there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. Actually, there could be a wrong answer, but there's different there are different correct answers or different ways of approaching it. But I think what we need to remember, or kind of what we want to get out of this conversation we're having today, is that having the right people in the room gives transparency to the conversations that we're having and ensures that everyone's aligned with it, and you have easier change management, and then you're able to approach it in much more of a phased approach, which makes the adaptation of technology much easier.
I think too, what you are today and or even what you want to be tomorrow, 5 years from now, is also continuously evolving as products that are, to your point earlier, mostly SaaS based, which means that features and functionality continue to be put out. Which means even if you think that what you're doing today versus doing 5 years is actually where you're going to be, you should always be evaluating what those new things are, because maybe it changes the way a very painful process that you didn't feel any way around, right? So it's a bigger investment than just saying, today I want to push a button and have all of these things work for me. Whether or not you could accomplish that, and you had a 3-year implementation process because you were going to do the whole world at once, the second you push that, it's like driving a car off the lot. It's depreciated, right?
Agreed.
So it's an investment you have to keep working on.
Any closing remarks, Romain?
Closing remarks. Well, I was going to piggyback off that, saying this, to your point, there's some decisions that need to happen that will be very difficult to undo. If we think of like lot management or zero tracking management, that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think we can come in also and pinpoint those to say, hey, by the way, that decision you're making of not tracking lots, this is what you're foregoing, or vice versa. This is what you're implying for operations. And so creating that connection between the different teams and deciders in the room is where I think we bring a lot of value, having done other implementations in the past.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today. It was really enjoyable. And thank you everyone for watching.
Yeah.
Have a great day.
Thanks a lot.